All right, it's 12 o'clock. It's Wednesday. It's time for an Iowa Learning Farms conservation webinar. So, thank you all for joining today. I'm Matt Helmers and have the great pleasure of getting to host today. I'm glad to be back in this platform rather than on camera as much like we did last week with Dr. Allison Robertson. But we'll be doing that again here coming up, I guess, this month with Dr. Wesley Everman to talk a little about weeds and cover crops in our Beyond the Basics cover crop series. But you're here today to hear from Dr. Amy Toth. Uh, Dr. Toth is a professor in ecology, evolution, and organismal biology. Say that 5 times fast. That is, but EEOB, as some might say around campus here. Dr. Toth is going to talk to us today about honeybees, friends for agriculture, foes for conservation. So, as always, if you have questions, please type those into the chat box and we'll get those to Amy at the end of the talk. With that, the virtual floor is all yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt, and thanks for the invitation to be here. My title's a little controversial, so it has a question mark at the end, and so I'm going to explore this topic with you today. Before I get started, I really want to thank a great team of students, postdoctoral researchers, and collaborators that I've worked with over the years. I don't want to be rushing at the end, so I want to thank them up front. Talking about 15 years of research, highlighting things that we've done, and these folks have made it all possible and just a wonderful team to work with. So shout out to all of the team that has made this work possible. Okay, so today we're talking about honeybees. And I suggested that they are certainly friends, and they've even been called humankind's greatest friend among the insects by Tom Seeley, who is an admitted honeybee lover, bee researcher. But there could possibly be a dark side to honeybees, and so I want to explore that today. First of all, just introducing you to the species itself, the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera. I am an organismal biologist, and so first and foremost, I love the organism. Honeybees are wonderful, fascinating creatures. There are actually 11 different species of honeybees across the world, and they're all native to the Old World. None of them are native to the New World. Apis mellifera is the specific species that has been moved all over the world for honey production, pollination, etc. And Apis mellifera is actually native to Africa, Europe, Western Asia, and the Middle East, not North America, although they've been naturalized in the United States for several hundred years. Honeybees and humans go way back, perhaps all the way to the dawn of humanity itself. Humans and honeybees have been interacting for thousands of years. There's evidence even from cave paintings from Spain from 8000 BC of people robbing bees for their honey. This is still done today in some parts of the world where there are wild honeybees that nest on the sides of cliffs, and very brave people will go and rob them of their honey. Apis mellifera is now semi-domesticated, meaning it is mostly under human care, especially outside of its native range, but it can live wild and it doesn't necessarily need human care to survive. Modern beekeeping practices were developed around 400 to 500 years ago, and the modern beehive seen here in this photo of Lorenzo Langstroth, who has a fantastic name and was a native of Ohio, actually have been around since about the 1850s, and this basic structure of beehive hasn't changed since. So today, honeybees are kept worldwide for honey production, pollination, profit, and of course, just the pleasure of being a beekeeper. Now, we all know that honeybees are star pollinators. They're extremely economically important. There are approximately 91 million managed beehives in the world. And this contributes an annual $7 billion of honey production. But the real value monetarily is in crop pollination. Honeybees interact with over 100 agricultural crops, contributing an estimated $500 billion a year in pollination services and an estimated $12 billion here in the US. And this photo is showing one of the most spectacular examples of that: honeybees pollinating almonds in California. And this is an absolutely massive scale pollination event that happens every year. Now, in Iowa, I want to tell you a little bit about our work on honeybees in Iowa. It turns out Iowa is a very difficult place to keep bees for several reasons. Um, Honeybees are kept in Iowa primarily for honey production or migratory beekeeping. That is, for example, taking those bees out of Iowa for pollination of crops such as almond. They are not needed for corn or soybean crops, which of course are the dominant forms of agriculture here in Iowa. However, keeping bees is difficult. So annually, Iowa is often one of the US states that has the highest mortality of honeybees. And in some years, this can get close to 70%. So imagine 70% of an animal's population dying every year. That is extremely difficult for beekeepers to stay in business. And it's a really difficult place to keep bees. A lot of this mortality is happening over the winter. So our prior work has tried to understand what is going on with honeybee health in Iowa. And we know that they heavily utilize clover and soybean in crop fields and field edges. And hives actually grow quite large in the midsummer and can make a decent honey crop. But after that period of time, there's a severe lack of forage in the late summer and fall, and these colonies often crash very hard and then do not do well over the winter. Our previous work has shown that access to prairie forage can potentially rescue hives during this late summer, early fall period. So we've done experiments to move hives to restored prairie patches, and we've also investigated the utility of prairie strips integrated into corn and soybean fields. And both of these things show benefits to honeybees in terms of mortality and also colony growth. We've also tried to understand the role of pesticides in the health of honeybees and actually found some somewhat interesting results that honeybee hives, even if placed right in the middle of a corn or soybean field, if exposed to foliar insecticide sprays, actually survive. They don't have a lot of acute mortality, but there's often these sort of low-level sublethal effects that are not apparent until later in the season, and that's exactly what we found in a very recent study. So bottom line, honeybees are hard to keep in Iowa, and it seems to be due to a combination of pesticide use and a lack of forage, especially in the late season, late summer, early fall period. However, Apis mellifera is just one species of very, very many. Bee diversity is an incredible thing. There are approximately 20,000 estimated species of bees in 7 families, and 4,000 of these occur in North America. As you may know, there are a lot of species that are not doing so well. Estimates range from 25 to upwards of perhaps even half of bee species in the Midwest being in decline. So this is, again, thought to be due to habitat loss, pesticides, and issues related to climate. A lot of these other bees outside of honeybees can provide pollination to crops, and they can have also major positive economic impacts for farms. Native bee pollination has been estimated to contribute about 3 billion per year in the US, so that's less than honeybees, but still substantial. And for specific crops, especially some fruit crops, bees are even non-honeybees are even more effective at pollination than honeybees. And often they can work in synergy with honeybees. For example, honeybees without these wild bees don't do as good of a job as pollinating. They actually can help each other and cause even better pollination when they work together. Now, here in Iowa, we have a pretty low diversity of native bees compared to some other regions in the US, but we actually still do have several hundred species. We don't have an exact list yet, but we estimate approximately 300 species of bees are native to Iowa. And they come in a lot of different flavors, about 6 different families. I'm just showing you a very few examples of some of these really amazing, beautiful native bee pollinators here from Iowa. Many of these are also very effective pollinators for fruit and vegetable crops. And bumblebees, for example, are really good at pollination. We have around 15 bumblebee species here in Iowa. Some haven't been seen very recently. But in a recent review by the Iowa DNR, 12 of these 15 bumblebee species are designated as species of conservation concern. And this even includes a couple species that are imperiled. So we have the rusty patch bumblebee here, which is on the endangered species list and is federally protected. They do occur at very low numbers here in Iowa. And then the American bumblebee is another example of a threatened species that's actually been petitioned for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So we have potentially a lot of wild bees here too in Iowa, but a lot of them are undergoing population declines. At the same time, there have been concerns about honeybees in their non-native range. Now, if there are all these environmental stresses that are eroding the health of honeybees and potentially other pollinators, if we add in a non-native species such as honeybees, this could add an additional stress to the native bees. And so I'm showing you a photo here. This is a picture from California. And there's a native species of bumblebee visiting a flower, and that very same flower is being swarmed by about 8 different honeybees for visiting that same flower at the same time. And this is just an example of a location in which honeybees are at very high densities. There's a lot of feral colonies in California, and they can potentially really swamp the numbers of wild bees occurring in an area. So there's concern that if there are too many honeybees in a particular area, that this could lead to competition for floral resources. So potentially these honeybees are getting more of this nectar and pollen than the native bees. And there's also the potential for disease spillover. Honeybees, as I mentioned, are semi-domesticated. And like a lot of domesticated animals, they have a lot of diseases. And some of these diseases can actually spill over to other pollinators. So there have been concerns about honeybees. There's also confusion about saving the bees, which generally speaking is a wonderful thing, and I'm fully in support of efforts to save the bees. But sometimes people confound 2 issues. One is the health and productivity of honeybees, which are a form of agriculture, and the conservation of native species. And I put verses here in quotes. I don't think they necessarily need to be verses. However, sometimes someone might have good intentions. They want to save the bees, and maybe they're thinking about conservation, and then they get a honeybee hive, which is maybe not necessarily the best thing for the native bee species in their area. And if you look at the scientific literature, the evidence is mounting that honeybees can have negative impacts on native bees outside of their native range. So for example, these are just a few studies from the past few years, including studies in Europe, California, and many different locations suggesting that honeybees can have negative impacts on native bees. Well, what about here in Iowa? So every region is different. Not all studies have found negative impacts of honeybees on native bees. We can't just assume negative impacts. I think this is really going to depend a lot on the context. For example, the landscape in which these bees occur, the amount of floral resources in the landscape, how many honeybee hives and feral honeybees are present in that area. Now, Iowa is generally low in floral resources, but also honeybee density is relatively low in Iowa. And perhaps native bees might have bigger problems than the presence of some honeybees, such as the lack of forage and pesticides that I mentioned earlier. So I think the bottom line for the moment is keep calm, show me the data, and that's what I'm here to do today. So we've been working on this question for several years, and I'm going to tell you what we know so far about the interactions between honeybees and native bees. So what do we actually know? So I'm going to divide this into 3 questions. The first is, do honeybees spread diseases to native bees here in Iowa? What is the potential for competition between honeybees and native bees for the same forage plants? Are they actually even using the same plants? And do honeybees affect native bee communities or populations? So if you actually go into an area that has honeybees, are there necessarily fewer native bees in that area, suggesting disease competition could potentially be negatively impacting their populations? So I'm going to first turn to the first question about disease in native bees. And the 2 questions that I'm going to address are, do honeybee diseases even get into native bees here in Iowa? And do they have negative effects when they do? So flowers are beautiful. We all love flowers, and bees love flowers too. But if you are a disease ecologist, you might start to see flowers as something disgusting and akin to dirty doorknobs. Pollinators are rubbing all over them. They're sometimes defecating onto these flowers as they're moving through their environment. And as they do that, they're most certainly depositing a lot of diseases, including things like viruses, onto the flowers. And then let's say a honeybee visits a flower and then a bumblebee visits that same flower a few minutes later. They can be picking up, for example, particles of a virus such as this deformed wing virus, which is known to be a really debilitating bee virus. So there is some evidence from the literature suggesting that flowers can be transmission sites for disease in bees. So in Iowa, we looked into some honeybee viruses, which are some of the main diseases of concern, and we found evidence that several honeybee viruses are indeed present in native bees here too in Iowa. I'm showing you data just from 3 of those viruses. On the left, you're going to see the percent of bees that we tested that were positive for these 3 different viruses. So we've got deformed wing, black queen cell virus, and one called Israeli acute paralysis virus, which is a very deadly virus. And we actually found evidence looking at multiple different groups of native bees that these viruses are also present. So that suggests, yes, these diseases can be spilling over from honeybees into other bee taxa. However, if you look at the graphs on the right, this is showing you the level of those viruses. So not just presence, absence, but the concentrations of those viruses. And for example, here in the first graph, but also in all the rest of them, the levels that we found in actually apparently healthy honeybees in yellow were substantially higher. This is a log scale than what we found in any of the wild bees. So these levels are extremely low. And so a lot of times, even ourselves, if we have a disease, we can be carrying it without actually getting infected and getting sick. So are these levels of concern or not? Another question that we wanted to address is if we add honeybees to an area, for example, a restored prairie habitat, can the bees that are foraging in that area actually pick up honeybee viruses? So we did an experiment in which we placed honeybee hives on restored prairies, and we compared the virus levels of some native bumblebee species in those restored prairies to restored prairies that did not have honeybee hives present. So here are some data showing the amount of viruses in 2 native bumblebee species. We have Bombus griseocolus, the brown-belted bumblebee, and Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. And we did find evidence that sites that had honeybee hives, the bumblebees had slightly higher levels of a couple of honeybee viruses, Israeli acute paralysis virus and deformed wing virus. However, again, when we look at the actual levels of these viruses, they're very, very low. So again, comparing to honeybees in hives and foraging honeybees, all of these are apparently healthy honeybees, by the way. The levels of bumblebees are even lower, and that was true for both viruses. So while wild bumblebees harbor honeybee viruses, these levels are extremely low and not indicative of what we would think would be an active infection that would make them sick. So what do we know about diseases so far? Honeybee viruses are indeed shared with other species of bees in their environment, and exposure to honeybee hives can increase wild bees' contact with these viruses. There is some potential for these viruses to be carried by or infect native bees, but none of the bees that we found are apparently sick, and all of the levels of viruses that we detected were very, very low. We still have a lot of work to do on this subject. We did do one experiment in which we took one of the deadly viruses, IAPV, and we tried to infect 2 species of non-honeybees with it. And the same dose that killed honeybees did not kill these 2 non-honeybee species. And so that's just one virus. There are a whole lot of diseases out there, and we haven't fully screened all of them. But thus far, we're not seeing any major red flags that a lot of the wild bee species are getting sick from at least some of the most common honeybee viruses that are of concern for honeybee health. Okay, so moving on to the next question. What is the potential for competition for the same forage plant? The 2 questions I want to address here are honeybees using the same or different resources as native bees over time? And does the presence of honeybees disrupt the interactions that wild bees are going to be having with native plants? So here I'm going to be talking about some studies that were done in the context of prairie strips. So these were small strips of prairie that were embedded within corn or soybean farms. And here is an example of that. And we did studies in which we had prairie strip sites that either had apiaries or they did not have apiaries. And this was some work by a former graduate student in the lab, Kate Borchardt. So first we wanted to ask how much overlap is there in the forage plants used by honeybees and native bees in these landscapes? So Kate did observations from June through August, several thousand minutes of observations. And she found that the bees were utilizing 43 different plant species in prairie strips. And she also found 93 different native bee species in these prairie strips. She found that honeybees were observed foraging on 15 different plants, and 13 of these overlapped with the plants that native bees were foraging on. However, there were 28 plants that native bees were foraging on that honeybees did not seem to be attracted to. Now, what are these plants that overlap in what they're foraging on between honeybees and native bees? Well, it turns out actually a lot of them were exotic or weedy species. A lot of native bees also like exotic and weedy species, and some of those are listed here. And among the 13, there were 4 native plants, including the ones shown here. Interestingly, a lot of these are quite abundant native plants. And so it seems like, yes, there is overlap, but it seems mostly centered on weedy exotic plants and very abundant native plants. The next thing we wanted to ask is, does the presence of honeybees disrupt how native bees interact with plants? And to do this, we're actually going to use an approach in which we use the same type of observations I just described, but we're going to build networks between the bees and the plants. So just to give you an idea of what that might look like, let's say here are 4 native plant species that we're interested in. Let's say we observe a bumblebee foraging on 3 of these species and a sweat bee foraging on 1 of these species. What we can do is look at sites with honeybees and without honeybees and compare these networks. So let's say now we add honeybees into this environment, and now the honeybees are foraging on some of the same plants that the native bees also want to forage on. If the honeybee, which is often a highly generalist species foraging on multiple species, starts foraging on some of these same plants, these native bees may actually change their foraging behaviors and start either focusing on different plants or even stop foraging on some of those plants due to increased competition. So what you can do is build these networks. So you have bee species, for example, and plant species. This is an example network. The thicker the line means the more times that connection was observed. So this really thick one means this is a particular bee and plant species connection that was observed many, many times, whereas some of these were observed more rarely. So what Kate did in this study was look at sites that had no honeybees present. And she examined this in June, July, and August. They're often very different plant communities and foraging patterns across the season. And she compared that to sites which had honeybee hives present. And essentially what she found is no obvious difference in the structures of these networks between sites that had honeybees and sites that did not have honeybees. So what do we know about forage plants so far? Well, honeybees do utilize native plants, especially in late summer and early fall. There's some overlap with the plants used by native bees, but these are actually mostly exotic, weedy, and pretty abundant native species. Many of these plants used by native bees are not attractive to honeybees, so that may help avoid some competition. And the presence of honeybees did not greatly disrupt bee-plant interactions in summer in prairie strips. So now moving on to the last question, how do honeybees affect native bee communities or populations? So we wanted to ask, when honeybees are present in an area, are there fewer native bees around? And are the native bees in those areas in a more starved condition? Are they smaller because possibly of competition and not having enough to eat? So we looked at this actually in multiple different studies in different types of landscapes. The first study I'm going to describe looked at soybean farms. So we looked at soybean farms and found no negative impact of honeybee hives on the wild bee communities that we found in those landscapes. However, we also compared farms that were in a context of either very high row crop cover, that's over 70% in a 1 mile radius around the farm, or less than 40% row crop cover. And here are the data. So what my student Ashley St. Clair found is the richness of wild bees, which is a measure of bee diversity, was actually not different between sites that had honeybee hives present or absent. That's the plus and minus here. Those were not different from each other. But what did make a difference was the landscape context. We saw more wild bee species in areas of low cultivation, that is, areas that had other types of habitat in the landscape, such as grassland or woodland. So this suggests perhaps a lack of habitat might be more important than honeybee hives in determining the richness of these bee communities. However, we also wanted to look at things like restored prairies. So we wanted to check and see if perhaps maybe there's some more sensitive species in restored prairies that might be responding more negatively to honeybee hives. So we had a couple of studies in which we had, again, prairies with or without beehives over a 2-year period. We wanted to do this for multiple years to account for possible delayed effects of multiple years of honeybee presence on populations. And here are the data from after 2 years of honeybees being present. And we looked at sites with hives and without hives. And we also looked at sites before moving honeybees and after moving honeybees. None of these things are different. So we found no significant impacts of honeybee hives on the abundance or the number of taxa in these prairies. We did a second study on this same theme that we published more recently, in which we had twice as many honeybee hives. We went from 4 to 8 per site and still found no difference. We also did this in prairie strips. So the experiment I just mentioned by Kate Borchardt. And this actually had an even larger apiary with 20 colonies, and the prairies are quite small, these prairie strips, compared to some of the restored prairie patches we had worked on before. So less forage and more honeybees. We still found, again, no effect on native bee abundance or species richness. However, this study ended in August, and so we still need to study the very late summer and early fall period when there could be more intense competition. So what about the health of native bees? Just because they're present doesn't mean they're okay. One of the cool things that we can do is we can measure the size and weight of bees, and we can do this non-destructively in the field. So this is a current grad student of mine, Erica Ibarra-Garibay, and what we can do is collect bees, put them on ice, and while they are sleeping, we can take body measurements. So that's what Erica's doing here, using calipers to measure things like their thorax width, what we call intertegular distance, and then she has a little scale here, which we use to measure weight in the field. Larger body size is generally an indicator of good nutrition during development, and bigger is generally better when it comes to being a bee, allows you to reproduce more and forage more efficiently. So we wanted to ask, are native bees in the presence of honeybees smaller due to reduced food availability? So the first study on this examined 3 common bumblebee species in the context of prairie strips. These are those 3 species. The common eastern and the brown-belted are the most common bumblebee species here in Iowa, and we found no difference in either thorax width or dry mass between sites that had honeybees and did not have honeybees. However, for the third species, the 2-spotted bumblebee, we did find a smaller body size at sites that had honeybees present. These are very, very common species. So the next thing we wanted to do is ask, what about some of these threatened species? So some very recent work that we've done across Iowa, looking at restored prairies, was to examine this in 2 imperiled species, the rusty patch bumblebee and the American bumblebee. We looked at both queens, which are very important in populations, and workers. And if for all of these measures, we looked at two measures of size, head width and thorax width, we found that bees were smaller in the presence of honeybees compared to sites that had no honeybees. So that suggests there could potentially be negative impacts for some sensitive species. What do we know so far about native bee communities and health? So we've done 4 studies in which we've looked really hard to see if there are differences between communities of native bees with the presence of honeybees, and we're not finding impacts. This suggests lack of habitat may be a bigger problem than honeybee competition for native bee communities, although we still want to look more deeply into that very late season period. And our work on imperiled bumblebee species suggests some species may be more sensitive than others to the presence of honeybees, and they may require special consideration when we're talking about conservation of those species. Okay, so just to summarize, what do we actually know from our studies? Do honeybees spread diseases to native bees? Well, yes, these diseases do seem to get into native bees. Thus far, we have little evidence for negative impacts, but we do need to continue to study more of the diseases. What is the potential for competition for the same forage plants? Well, some of the same forage plants are used by honeybees and native bee species, but these are mainly common or weedy plants. Does the presence of honeybees disrupt wild bee interactions with plants? We didn't see evidence for this in June, July, or August, but we'd like to continue to look at this again later in the season, just to make sure that there's not more competition at that period of time. Finally, do honeybees affect native bee communities or populations? We're not finding evidence of this, but we are finding some indications that sensitive species might be in a more starved condition when honeybees are around. So it may not apply to all species. I finally wanted to end on a little bit of a hopeful note. I did want to entertain the possibility that honeybees might be able to help native bees in some ways. One idea that remains untested is whether honeybees could increase the pollination of some plants that native bees depend on. This could even include some of those weedy exotic plants that the native bees actually like. There is no evidence for this yet, but it's not impossible and needs further study. The other reason that honeybees could help native bees is through public awareness. Honeybees have been called the gateway bug, which I think is a nice term. The idea being that interest in honeybees and concern about their health can get people aware of issues related to pollinators. I'm just going to end with a couple of quotes from people I admire very much. This is Marla Spivak, who is a honeybee researcher from University of Minnesota, recently retired. And she said, "We're all on a learning curve, all of us. It's like honeybees were a portal, the door to much larger issues, conservation issues in general." So when colony collapse disorder came onto the scene in 2006, this was a real eye-opener for people and really got a lot of people on board with thinking about pollinator declines. And finally, friend of the program, Jamie Beyer, who's a local beekeeper, wrote an interesting piece for the Central Iowa Beekeepers newsletter in which he said, "Beekeepers have become a champion of reduced pesticide use, habitat improvements, promoting native plants, more trees, and not mowing as often. Beekeeper efforts in promoting more habitat and less pesticide use is one step to saving native bees." So my final thoughts here are that honeybees cannot just be assumed to be negative for conservation. It all depends on the context. Like, what is the available forage? Is the environment disturbed? Are we talking about sensitive environments or species? Are we talking about agricultural environments? And what are your goals? Maybe your goal is to produce honey, in which case honeybees are exactly what you want. But if your goal is to protect sensitive native species like rusty patch bumblebees, then maybe honeybees are not the best choice. In some locations and contexts, our data suggests that honeybees can coexist with native bees, and Iowa may be one of these places. So overall take home, we should make decisions about saving bees in an informed way, not based on naive emotional reactions. And we need to really all be on the same page and work together. So for example, adding plants to farms that are used by both honeybees and native bees could be really helpful for all of the pollinators. Okay, I am gonna stop there and take questions.
All right, thanks so much, Amy. If you want to go to those logistical slides, we'll go through those. You can catch your breath. If you watch this webinar live and want to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker. Her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Do that by 5 o'clock today, including your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. Let's go to the next slide. Should be a voluntary demographic survey. If you're willing to fill this out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for all 2026 webinars. So if you've done so, thank you very much. If you're willing to, you can go to that link there, the iowalearningfarms.org/survey, or scan the QR code. Let's go to the next slide. We got Dan Anderson talking next week about manure and should we treat manure like human wastewater. So Dr. Manure is going to come and talk to us. So please tune in next week. Something quite different than this, I know, but important nonetheless. Let's go last slide, I think. Um, if you know somebody that might find interest in this webinar, they are archived, and so you can find it on the Iowa Learning Farm site or our YouTube channel. And I don't know if there's another slide, Amy. Was there one more on any?
No, more
Oh,
data.
no, more data. Okay, if there are questions, I also want to highlight and acknowledge the partners that make the Learning Farms webinars possible. Those are the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa DNR, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So if not for those, we wouldn't be able to put these on. So we got quite a few questions and we'll get started. The first one, are neonicotinoids as bad for bees as claimed?
Um, okay, yeah. I knew
Okay.
insecticides were going to come up. Yeah. And I didn't talk a lot about insecticides. There are people that have been working on that here at Iowa State. I'm peripherally involved in that work, so I'll do my best to try to cover the topic. So we have looked at, for example, prairie strips. There's some concerns that the neonicotinoids that are used in seed treatments in corn and soybeans, get into the soil, are taken up by plants, can get into the pollen and nectar that the bees are foraging on, and then potentially poison the bees so that, things like prairie strips could be this sort of ecological trap because it looks like a lot of good food, but it's toxic. So there have been studies that have, by folks at Iowa State, that have looked at the levels of neonicotinoids in the soil, in plant tissue, nectar, pollen, and bees that have actually been foraging in prairie strips. The levels of neonicotinoids that they found are generally extremely low. Most of them were below levels of detection. But the levels that were found were much lower than those that were considered to be levels of concern based on toxicity studies. Those toxicity studies are usually done on honeybees. And so honeybees are not representative of all bees, but they are at least a starting place for understanding potential toxicity. So all the levels that are found are really, really low. In fact, other pesticides were found at higher levels than neonicotinoids. And so some of the pyrethroid insecticides, were found at higher levels, and some fungicides as well. So those actually might present slightly higher risk. There were a few that came up as levels that would be potentially harmful to bees, but most of the samples came out as being really, really low still. So it seems like there could be like occasional exposure to some of these insecticides that could be negative. But overall, the results were not causing us to be concerned of this ecological trap idea. So generally, there's really good forage, and some of that good forage can offset some of the negative impacts of insecticides.
Here's one. We'll shift gears. This one might be a little more straightforward, but kind of interesting. To detect a virus in a bee, is it a destructive assay?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so most of the viruses infect the gut tissue, so the stomach, and so we have to dissect the bees in order to get the viruses out of the gut. Some people have been looking for diseases in feces, which is kind of an exciting new development. Speaking of feces, so so you can actually there are methods to try to get a bee to poop on command, and
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
I
and it
learned
sometimes
something new
works.
today. Yeah.
It sometimes works,
Okay.
and of course, the amount of disease particle, like viral particles that are going to be in feces, is going to be quite a bit lower than it would be in the gut tissue where it's actually infective. But there is some evidence that you can detect some of the diseases in fecal matter. So yes, potentially that's something that we've been looking into, methods for producing feces on
Okay. All right. Um, are there any significant crop species that honeybees don't like?
uh Yeah, interesting question. I mean, obviously corn being wind pollinated. Weirdly enough, honeybees will visit corn for pollen. when they're really desperate.
Okay.
But honeybees will also collect sawdust when they're really desperate. And
Oh,
so,
wow.
when they're extremely hungry, they will resort to lower quality food sources, including corn pollen. So yeah, we have found them foraging on corn pollen occasionally. I wouldn't say they like it, they probably don't like it. But yeah, so and then there are other crop species. For example, we've been looking into strawberry pollination recently, and honeybees are often placed on orchards for pollination of various fruit crops, including strawberries, but it turns out they just really don't like them very much.
Oh,
They
wow.
don't visit very often. And so I think a recent study was looking at that here in Iowa and found only like less than 1% of the pollinators that were visiting strawberries were honeybees.
Oh, wow.
So they'll visit occasionally, but they're not especially attracted to some of these crops.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions here on Africanized bees. So
Mhm.
they ask, in the desert Southwest, aren't the vast majority of naturalized hives Africanized now, no longer European honeybees?
Yes, that's true. So there has been a spread of African derived subspecies of honeybees that started in Brazil and they've spread pretty widely northward. And so, yeah, in the Pacific Southwest and parts of the southern US, most of the feral hives that you would find would have some African derived genetics in them. And the aggressive behavior associated with that subspecies of bees from Africa tends to be a dominant trait. And so
Okay.
often, when there is some introgression of these African subspecies that spread from Brazil after they had been brought over there for breeding
Okay.
program, yes, that a lot of them are slightly more aggressive.
Okay, that kind of feeds into the next question that they had asked. We've had cases of domesticated honeybee hives in Southwest Wisconsin, excuse me, being taken over by very aggressive naturalized bees. Are these the same as Africanized bees?
Mm, yeah. Unlikely. So the African derived subspecies, they have a very low cold tolerance for the winter. And so the region of Africa that they are native to is very warm. And they have quite a few differences in their biology. And they're unlikely to be able to store enough honey and survive the winter in cold areas like
Okay.
Iowa. So it's unlikely that those would be African derived. Now, there is
Okay.
some genetic variation among European subspecies that have been brought over to the United States. So the most common subspecies that we keep is an Italian subspecies, which is very, very gentle. But there are some other mixes out there of different subspecies that tend to be more aggressive. And so it is possible that some of those feral hives could have different genetic backgrounds. Um, and there's also just variation. So, even the Italian bees that we work with, like occasionally we just get a hot hive and not exactly sure if it's genetic or some environmental influence that led them to become more aggressive, but there is quite a bit of variation. And some of those feral hives, the ones that do well, are often kind of aggressive. And so there could be a correlation there actually where that could help with survival.
Can you share how many apiaries per acre there were for the species richest studies? Would beekeepers want to have more
Mm.
bee boxes in these areas, or were the beekeepers maxed out on beekeeping areas, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah. So we did anywhere from 4 to 20 hives, and that was we generally would check there's a honeybee registry for the state of Iowa. It's voluntary. So, it's underestimating the density of honeybee hives. But generally, we made sure there were no other hives in the area. So ours would have been the only ones, like a mile radius. So the density would have been, anywhere from 4 to 20 hives per square mile for our studies. That's a pretty low density, actually, compared to what some people use for honey production or pollination. And they probably weren't like maxing out necessarily on the available floral resources, at least during the boom period when soybeans blooming and a lot of the weedy species are blooming. Later in the season, however, I think they are resource limited in that same environment.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of feeds into another question. They wondered if you had any suggestions for maximum number of honeybee hives relative to the feed supply to avoid disruption of native bees.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we kind of we tried different environments and it does seem like highly farmed landscapes are going to be more limited, especially for the native bees. So we're seeing like fewer native bees in those landscapes, suggesting that they're going to be more sensitive to the presence of honeybees. However, even within that landscape, our studies used about 8 hives and didn't find any negative impacts. So, like within a highly farmed area, I would feel pretty comfortable with 8 honeybee hives, not necessarily having a huge immediate negative impact on the wild bee communities.
Okay. Um, Here's one little different, but any comment on or thoughts on education campaigns like No Mo May, to what extent this practice might be beneficial for honeybees or native bees?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think anything that gets more flowers on the landscape is good. And, springtime tends to be a period of time where there is limited forage. I think the argument against no mow May is that there might be like better ways to integrate floral resources into your landscape. So by not mowing, you're going to increase a lot of the weedy species, and they're not necessarily they're better than a lawn with no flowers in them.
Yeah.
But you might do more good by, throwing down some seed for native spring ephemerals or something like that,
Okay.
instead of not mowing, or maybe both, right? So then you can potentially get both benefits.
Okay. We're going to go north of the border here for this question because canola pollination and production. They utilize both leaf cutter bees and honeybees. Any comment or insight?
Yeah, so the leafcutter bees that are used for crop pollination are also non-native. So that's a European species, Megachile rotundata. And honeybees love canola too. I mean, they're all over it. So yeah, I think that that's a situation in which there's plenty of forage for the honeybees, and they're probably going to be heavily utilizing it. We actually have worked on a local farm that had canola, and a lot of the bumblebees seem to really like canola as well. So some
Okay.
of these mass blooming crops, unlike a lot of the more common crops in Iowa, actually can be sometimes beneficial to
Okay.
not only honeybees, but even some of the native bee species, just because of the sheer number of blossoms. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure if the question was like, would you be better off without leafcutter bees and honeybees because they're non-native? That's a case in which there might be enough to go around during that
Okay.
bloom period.
During that blooming period. Okay. What have you found helps bees to overwinter?
Mm. I assume they're talking about honeybees.
So,
Yeah, the single biggest thing that kills honeybees over winter is not having taken care of parasitic mites prior to winter. And so the single best predictor of mortality is mite levels. That is like if you're taking care of your mites, you're gonna get way better overwintering automatically. Beyond that, going into the winter with a large population is important. And so good forage, good feed in the winter, pre-wintering period, like in the fall, late summer. We found that access to good forage can actually also boost overwintering survival.
maybe just a couple more in the interest of time, but do you see any regional patterns in honeybee versus native bee distributions across Iowa or the Midwest? Is there any precipitation, geology, or any site-specific impacts?
Mm. Yeah, there it is quite variable. So we most of our work has been in central Iowa, but with our work on rusty patch bumblebees, we've been going more to the eastern part of the state, northeastern part of the state as well. And there are very different bee communities, actually native bee communities in the northeastern part of the state compared to the central part of the state. And one of the big differences in the habitat as well is the presence of forested areas. And so forested areas have turned out to be really important for a lot of native bee species. And of course, in central Iowa, we're pretty limited on forest. Northeastern Iowa, there's more forest. And so we actually see more diversity, and we see some of the more sensitive species present in those areas. But the cool thing is that even in central Iowa, mostly along river corridors where there's some forest, some of those sensitive species are also occurring. So like we're finding rusty patch bumblebees here in central Iowa, but it's only where there are rivers and where there are forests. So it seems like some of these habitat corridors could be really important within Iowa.
Okay. Um, somebody here, somebody asked a question. They have some area with white snake root that they're trying to preserve, and they had used some heavy machinery and herbicides in that area for the invasives. Just recently discovered ground bees, and they were wondering how these bees, if they might be able, kind of what might happen after that machinery use, and can they dig themselves out if they had run over the holes?
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing we didn't talk, this is a great theme. One thing I didn't talk a lot about is nesting habitat. And so
Yeah.
we focus a lot on flowers
That
and
might be another, maybe we can get you back to do another webinar on that, Amy. So, but
I
okay,
know.
sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff there, bees and soil. And actually the majority of our native species are ground nesting. So they're going to be nesting in soil or some just on the surface of the ground. And so like tillage, for example, can really disrupt a lot of the nesting sites for some of these ground nesting bees. And then, yeah, habitat disturbance, similar to what you're describing, can certainly be challenging for bees that are nesting in the ground. So I guess like minimizing, preventing soil disruption would potentially benefit a lot of these ground nesting species. Can they recover after a disturbance? To some extent, like the ones that were in there at that moment will probably die. But if then that land is taken care of and not disturbed frequently, then others from the population can re-inhabit those same areas.
Okay. Great. That might be something, yeah, to think about is what can we do for
Yeah.
that habitat,
Mm.
that side, I guess, yeah, that area. I'm fascinated by this. I want a webinar on that, Amy. So, okay, this is really great. This was super informative, at least for me, and I think by the number of questions that we got, also by participants. So, in the interest of time, we will let Amy go there to get back to probably teaching a class or something. But I really want to thank Dr. Amy Toth for a fabulous webinar. I want to thank you all for attending. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. The webinar will be archived and up there, so send it to somebody that you think might have interest. And please consider tuning in next week to hear from Dr. Dan Anderson about manure. So, with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thanks for